welcome to the Oxford Jurisprudence Discussion Group. This is our seventh seminar of Michaelmas term 2021, and we have the pleasure today of being joined by Irina Sakharova. Irina holds an MJur from the University of Oxford and is currently finishing her PhD at the National University of Singapore. Today we will be discussing her paper, The Power to Contract as a Jointly Exercised Normative Power. Hello Irina, welcome to the JDT. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to present my work at the Jurisprudence Discussion Group. The paper that I'm presenting today is part of my broader work on distinguishing the power to contract from the other normative powers and arguing for its sui generis status. In my presentation, I will highlight some of the main themes and points of the paper, and I hope that we can discuss the paper itself during the Q&A. So I'll start with a couple of terminology observations. In my paper, I use the notion of a normative power as covering both moral and legal powers. However, since I deal with the legal institution of contract, the normative power to contract mostly translates into the legal power to contract. I take it that the exercise of a legal power affects a change in a legal situation, and that it brings about this change normatively and not only causally. The notion of a legal power that I use in my paper is also broadly consistent with how powers are understood in the Hatfieldian schema of futural relations and the Hatfieldian analysis of contract formation in terms of normative or legal powers is what the paper mainly focuses on. Although the expression the power to contract is used in moral and legal theory, contract formation is typically portrayed as merely two steps at which contracting parties exercise different unilateral normative powers, the power to offer and the power to accept. The offer and acceptance analysis, at least in contract theory, has been questioned as not being easily applicable to certain methods of contracting, such as signing a contract simultaneously by the parties. But where this analysis is applicable, the analysis itself has not been challenged as an analytic explanation of how such normative powers as offer and acceptance generate such a normative result as entering into a contract. And this is exactly the challenge that I pursue in my paper. I argue that even if the powers to offer and to accept are exercised, as they are in certain methods of contracting, these are simply not the normative powers that can create contractual obligations. In legal theory, of course, a classic statement of the offer and acceptance analysis in terms of normative powers is made by Wesley Hohlfeld, and this statement has been by and large endorsed in contract theory. On the Hatfieldian analysis, entering into a contract is a two-step process. There are two steps that correspond to two consecutive normative changes. First, one party, by exercising the unilateral power to offer, vests a new power, the power to accept, in the other party, and that power correlates with the first party's liability. And secondly, the other party, by exercising the newly acquired unilateral power to accept, brings about a contractual relationship between the parties. Contract formation in this model involves basically two consecutive normative changes. One is interim, the other party is empowered to accept what is offered by the first party, and in so doing to alter both parties' normative position. and the other change is final. A contract is concluded between the parties. On the face of it, the two-step analysis of contract formation seems rather compelling, but it is not difficult to see on this analysis where we can find such a thing as the normative power to contract. And this is the power that it is often said persons have. At best, the power to contract could be seen as some shorthand for the power to accept, or perhaps as some metaphorical amalgam of the power to offer and to accept. It is only metaphorical as it is difficult to see how two normative powers could be transformed or rather transmogrified into some other normative power. And more specifically, it appears that no one has any power to enter into a contract ab initio. The only power that persons have is a power to empower some other person to create a contractual relationship. And then a contractual relationship can be created in the result of exercising the power to accept, but no one has this power ab initio. It is merely a power that persons may acquire if and when someone who does not have any power to create a contractual relationship exercises the power to offer. There is, of course, a causal relation between exercising the power to offer and such a normative result as a contractual relationship, but it is only the power to accept that brings about this relationship normatively and not only causally. The normative result that the power to offer brings about normatively and not only causally is the situation in which somebody is empowered to create a contractual relationship. So it appears that the power that creates a contract is derivative, while the power from which the power to create a contract is derived is an only causal and not a normative relation with creating a contract.
Irina? Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah, there seems to be a problem with your presentation. I don't know if apparently you changed the slides, but it didn't change for us. I mean, it's just frozen. If you can perhaps move exactly, then it works perfectly. It's sorry for that. So we don't miss your presentation. If you share the screen again, it's going to work. I'm pretty sure. Thank you. I'm sorry for that.
Okay. Is it working now?
It is. It is. Thank you. Yes.
So the slide that you can see is the Hafelian analysis of contract formation, right? Okay.
Yes.
So a two-step analysis of this sort can surely explain certain private law normative changes. For example, in the case of giving authority by the principal to the agent, we can see exactly these two steps. But this analysis is at odds with the idea that the parties to a contractual relationship must together agree to enter into this relationship, and with the intuition that the power to enter into contractual relationship that the parties must exercise should be one and the same normative power. In my paper, I defend that intuition and try to explain why entering into a contract depends on the exercise by the parties jointly of a sui generis normative power that everyone has ab initio. And in the paper, I start with illustrating some of the limitations of the two steps analysis as an explanation of contractual agreements by contrasting gifts and contracts for sale. I take it that a common law gift is generated by a unilateral power to give or to transfer as a gift, as perfecting a gift either by delivery or by deed doesn't require any acceptance or even knowledge on the part of the deniee. But the agreement model of gifts is often analyzed in contract theory, and I think that it is helpful to consider an agreement model of gifts as a hypothetical model to make several relevant observations. So if gifts are considered, and if we take the hypothetical agreement mode of gifts, then first, only one party has the power to offer to give and can trigger a stepwise process of giving by exercising this power. The other party's role is confined to the final stage of the process, as the deni obviously is not able to initiate the process of giving, at least in legal terms. Secondly, the parties are not able to switch their roles as offeror and offeree in the process. Once the power to offer to give is exercised, the only option that the other party has is to accept the gift or to reject it. And acceptance must be a complete response to the offer. The other party is not able to counter-offer and to reverse the party's roles. It is indeed true that the deni doesn't have ab initio any power to accept a gift that would exist independently of the power to offer this particular gift by somebody else. And lastly, even if the donor is seen as offering to give, as the deni's acceptance of the gift is necessary on the agreement model, the donor must actually have the power to give and exercise this power for any given to take place. Offering is not enough, and it is the power to give that is fundamental for understanding the legal mechanism of giving, even if an agreement model is applied to common law gifts. And in contracting, and I use an example of the contract for sale, but it is applicable to any contracts, the situation is basically reversed. First, either party, by exercising the power to offer to enter into a contract, can empower the other party to accept the offer. Either party has the power that can trigger the process of negotiating and ultimately concluding the contract. Secondly, the parties can easily switch their roles in the process as the offeror and the offeree. If the seller offers the buyer to enter into a contract and empowers the buyer to accept the offer, accepting the offer is not the only option for the buyer. If the buyer wants to enter into the contract with the seller, the buyer can, of course, counter-offer and change the terms of the seller's offer, and in so doing to put the other party into the position of the offeree. It seems to be merely circumstantial who offers and who accepts, and once the contract is concluded, it is also not important. It is largely not important who was the offeror and who was the offeree. The seller and the buyer and any contracting parties are simply the parties to the contract. And lastly, in contrast with gifts, contracting parties can enter into a contract simply by exercising the power to enter into the contract, even if contracting parties do not have the collateral powers that are necessary to comply with the contract. For example, the seller doesn't need to have any power to sell in order to enter into a contract for sale, and even if the seller actually has this power, its exercise is not necessary for concluding the contract for sale. This contrast between contracting and giving suggests that even if an agreement model is applied to common law gifts, speaking about the parties' power to agree would be notional, as the parties exercise different powers at two consecutive steps, with one power being primary or constitutive and the other secondary or derivative. In contracting, however, even if the parties exercise the power to offer and to accept, the stepwise process of offering and accepting is notional, because the real normative change entering into a contract seems to be determined by the parties' joint exercise of one and the same power to agree. And the next question that I ask in my paper is why, despite the limitations of the offer and acceptance analysis, contract theory still purports to explain persistently the power that creates contractual obligations by reducing it to the unilateral and different powers to offer and to accept, paying little, if any, attention to the power to contract itself. And I suggest a twofold answer. First, contract formation often takes two steps at which the party exercise the power to offer and the power to accept. And a typical model of contracting, which is analyzed in contract theory, involves what might be referred to as a quid pro quo contract, in which each party performs in exchange for the other party performance. And although there is an immediate and recognized in contract theory problem of describing one party's contribution to the formation of the contractual agreement as a mere passive acceptance of something that is offered, it is still quite tempting to see offering and accepting as mirroring the two sides of the contractual equation. And secondly, it seems, at least to me, but I think I'm not alone in that legal theories have been somewhat more comfortable with dealing with unilateral powers, whereas the normative powers that are shared with others and have to be exercised jointly often appear as puzzling or mysterious. And to understand whether such powers are indeed puzzling or mysterious, I then look at a relatively uncontroversial case of exercising a normative power jointly, and that is collective decision-making in a body of an incorporated entity. In this case, we typically do not resort to the notions of offering and accepting, and we do not tend to apply a two-step or a last act analysis in explaining the process of decision-making. What is happening is that the members of a particular collective body vote for or indeed against a particular decision of this body. And in the paper, I consider several voting scenarios. I will not go through the details of that analysis now, but I try to demonstrate that despite the fact that the members may and often do exercise the power to vote in a particular sequence, and despite the fact that sometimes voting by a particular member of the board might look like decisive, it is in fact merely circumstantial who votes first, who votes last, and more importantly, when the members do vote, they exercise one and the same power, creating identical normative changes. If taken individually, each instance of exercising this power from first to last changes the normative landscape in exactly the same way. The member loses the right to vote on the matter, and there is a vote to count. And only jointly they bring about a different normative change. The decision of the collective body is reached. On the basis of this analysis, I make three suggestions as to why it might be easier to see in this case the power that is exercised to reach a decision. The power to vote is indeed one and the same normative power exercised jointly by the individual members of the collective body. And the first suggestion is that a plurality of participants obviously complicates very significantly the offer and acceptance story, as there are multiple steps. But even if there are only two members of any particular board, there is still no quid pro quo element. there are no sides of an equation, contractual or not, that offering and accepting could mirror, as there is no equation itself. The members are not participating in an exchange by offering and accepting. They are pursuing some common cause by trying to reach a decision that can be beneficial or detrimental for all of the members. And secondly, despite the fact that the members of the board vote in a particular sequence, we might tend to disregard any temporal gap between different instances of exercising the power to vote. We might treat the whole process of voting as one prolonged moment of time and assume that all the members vote simultaneously. And as we will see later in my presentation, it appears that simultaneity is often treated as a proxy for togetherness, especially in counts of contract formation. But it is clearly not important whether there is any temporal gap between different instances of exercising the power to vote, and it is not important whether or not we disregard such a gap where it actually exists, as acting together is simply not the same as acting simultaneously. And lastly, in the case of voting, there is a pre-existing framework allowing both an independent observer and the members of the board themselves to see or to understand what exactly the members are doing when each of them individually votes for or against a collective decision of the board. This framework includes the rules on voting in the board, determining who can do what, when they can do it, and how they can do it in order to achieve a particular result together. But in the paper, I suggest that while there must be some framework for exercising a normative power jointly, there may be different ways in which such a framework can be created, and no pre-existing institutional framework is in fact necessary. And I move to demonstrate how such a framework can be created in the case of contracting. I start with what I refer to as multilateral contracts, which are normally on the periphery of contract theory if they are analyzed at all. An example of this model is a contract underlying an unincorporated association. Concluding such contract could be compared, although not analogized to collective decision-making in an incorporated association. As with voting, a plurality of parties defies representing contract negotiation as offering and accepting, as we have multiple steps once again. But such representation is also at odds with the nature of multilateral contracts. The parties do not exchange anything on a quid pro quo basis, rather they agree with and ultimately to particular terms of the contract between them. Or to express it metaphorically, they vote for these terms. As with voting, there is also an element of simultaneity, real or merely assumed, which might cloud the analysis. But regardless of whether the parties agree to enter into the contract on particular terms simultaneously or in a particular sequence, the legal point of agreeing to particular terms by the parties is entering into the contract and not empowering the other parties to exercise some newly acquired power. Once we have multiple persons, the offer and acceptance story simply collapses because it is not possible to ascribe any offers and acceptances to each individual party to a contract that we are considering. But as different from voting, there does not have to be any prior relationship between the parties in this case. And there is no institutional framework within which it is clear that when parties do something, they jointly exercise a particular power. The parties can simply meet at an event, they start negotiating, and then they conclude a contract. And the parties are often complete strangers, yet they can surely enter into a contract that could be described as a multilateral contract. And to do so, they exercise the power to agree jointly. And to exercise the power to agree jointly, obviously some framework is necessary. And in the paper, I argue that the requisite framework is created by contract negotiation, if we conceive of this term very broadly. And I explain it further by considering what I refer to as a bilateral or a quid pro quo contract, and such contracts are a typical focus of contract theory. In bilateral contracts, contract formation is normally seen as involving two steps, at which the parties exercise the powers to offer and to accept, even if it doesn't work in some methods of contracting. But in the literature, and actually in the cases, there are also attempts to incorporate the idea of simultaneity in the stepwise analysis of the formation of a bilateral contract. And it is typically done by suggesting that the offer continues in time, that acceptance must be taken as somehow simultaneous with the offer, and that the offer is both fixed and incomplete. And the impetus behind such suggestions, as I think, is the realization that it is necessary to provide an explanation of how the parties together actively and not merely passively enter into a contract on particular terms. And this is an explanation that the offer and acceptance analysis simply does not provide. It is not easy to understand how, as a normative power, the power to offer can be both fixed and incomplete. A normative power is, of course, understood with a reference to the normative result at which the exercise of such power is directed. If the unilateral power to offer is understood with a reference to the normative situation in which the offeree is empowered to accept something that is offered, there is simply no conceptual space for supposing that the offer, as a unilateral normative power, bringing about that normative result, can continue in time. Someone can perfectly succeed in offering something as soon as something has been offered. Any acceptance itself is obviously irrelevant. Acceptance might be relevant for receiving what is offered, but not for offering. And the state of affairs in which something is offered may continue, of course, but the offer as a normative power is exercised once it is exercised. The offeror could be taken to agree to the state of affairs in which the offeree is empowered to bring about a contractual relationship between the parties. But such a relationship would be the result of exercising the offeree's unilateral power to accept alone, and that would be the second step. There would be a causal, once again, but not a normative relation between exercising the power to offer and entering into the contract. And in my opinion, it seems that in order to link normatively and not merely causally such a result as entering into the contract to a normative power exercised by the offeree and the offeror, we need to construe this power as something different from the unilateral power to offer. And I argue in the paper that either party enters into the contract by exercising the power to contract, by exercising this power, or by agreeing to enter into the contract with the other party on particular terms, or to put it metaphorically, by voting for these terms, the party does what it takes to enter into this contract, and what, for example, the offeror does must be defined in the case of the power to contract and not the power to offer, with reference to the normative situation in which there is a contract between the parties, and not with reference to some interim normative situation in which the offeree has the power to accept the offer. Of course, if the offeror exercises the power to contract by exercising the power to offer, or at the same time as exercising the power to offer, no contract between the parties is created unless and until the offeree also agrees to enter into this contract with the offeror on these specific terms, or in other words, unless the offeree exercises the power to agree or to contract by also voting for the terms of the contract. But this is just another way to say that the parties must exercise the power to agree or the power to contract together or jointly to achieve the result at which exercising this power by either of the party is directed. And in the paper, I also analyzed the unilateral power to accept in a similar way. I will not go through all the details of that analysis at this moment, but a basic suggestion is that we should treat the power to contract as analytically distinct from the power to offer or the power to accept, even if the power to contract can and often is exercised at the same moment as the offeror exercises the power to offer and the offeree the power to accept. And a central claim in that part of the paper is that in the absence of some pre-existing framework, exercising the unilateral powers to offer and to accept creates the conditions in which the parties, in which two persons not yet in a contractual relationship with each other, can jointly exercise one and the same power to contract without any prior arrangement as to exercising this power. Accepting a particular offer by a particular offeree ensures that the power to contract is exercised jointly, but it is the power to contract that normatively brings about the contractual relationship. And once the unilateral powers to offer and to accept are understood as merely creating conditions for exercising the power to contract jointly, it becomes easier to see that there is no need to invent offers and acceptances in those methods of contracting in which it is very difficult to find any, such as, for example, in the written contract signed by the parties simultaneously. There is no need if the necessary conditions for exercising by the parties the power to contract can be created, and in the case of a written contract signed by the parties simultaneously, prior negotiation of the terms, and then an agreement to this term by signing the contract obviously creates the necessary conditions. So I conclude that regardless of the method of contracting, it is the power to contract that creates any contractual relationship, whether this power is exercised in a particular sequence or simultaneously. And it is the power that persons have ab initio, because any party can start negotiation by exercising the power to contract, and any person has this power without being specifically empowered by somebody else. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.